Hello class, today we're going to talk about contact between cultures. This comes from our textbook, An Introduction to Intercultural Communication by Jandt. So these are the topics we're going to discuss today. We're going to talk about the contact zone, globalization, imperialism, how imperialism or colonialism continues today as corporate colonialism. We're going to discuss intercultural icons, how ideas are spread or cultural diffusion, and then finally how we market these cultural icons. Okay, so let's first define the contact zone. So your textbook defines the contact zone as the space in which people geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations. So this means groups of people are separated either by region or historically separated, so maybe by border, for example, and then they come into contact with each other. We've seen this throughout history. So the contact zone could include things like imperialism or colonialism. So this could be like forced or hostile takeover. So a country with more money and more resources and more power simply just go into an area and claim that area as their own. The next could be like political takeover. So maybe policies or trade policies. Then there's also corporate trade. So maybe businesses are now doing business in other countries or trading with other nations as well. And so they would establish relations for that. So I encourage you to think about some examples throughout history of when cultures come into contact for any of these reasons. I recently traveled to New Zealand and I noticed that the Queen of England was printed on their $20 bill in New Zealand. And so I was asking some of the locals about this, and I didn't know this, but Australia and New Zealand were colonized by the British. And so much of their money has the logo of the Queen of England on there. All right, so next let's define globalization. So as a result of countries coming into contact with each other, we see globalization. So this is worldwide intensification of interactions. So interactions of things like money, people moving, goods, services, and even just ideas, beliefs, values, and norms. So globalization has been occurring for a long time, but really intensified over the last 40 years. Due to businesses spreading, technology, the ability to travel. And humans have planted, grazed, excavated, and built on at least 40% of the Earth's surface. So, what are some of the effects of globalization? We're going to go into 4 major effects of globalization. The first side effect of globalization is called the time-space compression. So, this is the ability to communicate, to travel to different spaces much, much faster. Hence the phrase time-space compression. So this means that, let's say somebody from China gets a job in the United States. They may move their entire family to New York City, but they might be able to communicate via FaceTime or just call. They could even go back home with flights across the world. They could send money back and forth. And so we have this ability to communicate and travel much faster than we ever have before. Another side effect is called flexible accumulation. So globalization is occurring and it's allowing corporations to accumulate profit easily. So they're able to have these new innovations like offshoring or taking their businesses to another country or even outsourcing their labor or materials so that they can have greater profits. So one of the effects of globalization, the third effect, is uneven development. So although we have these corporations doing business abroad, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's benefiting the local people. So some regions are now developing in these rapid rates, but it's leaving larger gaps. So let's say a company does business in India. It might establish plants in the area, but it doesn't necessarily develop the region or villages around it. So, globally, right now, 3.2 billion people in the world have internet, which seems like a lot, but actually 4 billion do not have internet. So, we see areas sort of rapidly increasing with technology while others are being left behind. And we also see extreme concentrations of wealth due to globalization and the spreading of these corporations, while about 40% of the world's population live in poverty. So, an example of uneven development is CEOs taking excessive compensation. I'm going to use Nike as an example, but if you do a little research, you're going to find that most CEOs, Amazon, Walmart, for example, take excessive compensation, or they take a lot more than they give their employees. So, former CEO of Nike, Mark Parker. He's still involved with the company as the current president, and he sits on the board, takes a total compensation of about $13 million a year. And that ends up being 550 times the salary of the median or average Nike employee, which is only about $25,000. And I thought that these ads from Nike, these are print ads from Nike, were kind of ironic and also telling about what they're trying to advertise and also maybe the corporate culture. So this one says, Nike, stop dreaming, start working. And the next one was, success is earned, not given. So just kind of reflect on these and maybe what they're reflecting about the corporate culture. Okay, and so the final effect of globalization is migration. So we see accelerated movement of people, so people moving within their own countries. For example, in Japan, many people living in rural areas are moving to the cities like Tokyo, for example, so that they can get a job and support their family. We also see migration in between countries, so somebody moving from their home country to a new country for a job. Globalization has led to more than 232 million people migrating to different countries. And a lot of this migration has occurred in the United States. So we see 46 million people moving to the United States for work. And most of the migration is moving from more rural areas to urban areas or cities. And that's according to the United Nations. Okay, so contact between culture. We know that cultures are now coming into contact more than ever. So let's reflect what aspects of culture can now be influenced by contact. So remember, culture is beliefs, values, norms, behaviors, and practices. So if you imagine these cultures coming together, probably a lot of areas of our lives would be influenced. Things like art and music, food, education, politics, language, for example. And it is important to note that although we see the spreading of culture, sometimes contact results in a loss of culture. So we do see a lot of loss of language when cultures come into contact, and sometimes loss of cultural traditions. So you might move to a new area and simply assimilate to a new culture and leave your former culture behind. You might integrate the two cultures together, but it is important to note that we don't always see the spreading of culture. Sometimes we see the loss as well. If we even think about Southern California, we can think of all of these small neighborhoods that have a lot of culture to them. So, for example, if you go down to Los Angeles, there's Olvera Street, so you can get Mexican food, you can see festivals here. They have a Day of the Dead festival. And so this is an example of when cultures come into contact, how we might see the spread of culture. Another example of the spread of culture would be the Alhambra in Spain. So this is a castle in Granada, Spain. And if you take a look at the architecture here, it has Arabic architecture. And that's because this area was once owned by Arabic nations. And when the Spanish took it over, they left the castle in place, but you can still see all of the old architecture. So you're going to see all of these intricate carvings here in the castle. And you're also going to see these archways here, which are more of an Arabic style. This is actually the castle for Ferdinand and Isabella, and it was built as a fortress and then later turned into a castle. So when cultures come into contact, we also see cultural imperialism or colonialism. So I'm going to kind of use these terms interchangeably. So imperialism is the promoting, and it's really important to emphasize this word, imposing of one's culture over another group. So that means that maybe the other group, or most definitely the other group, probably is not welcoming of this new culture coming in. So it could be extending a country's power or influence over another group through things like direct territorial takeover, like military takeover, just taking over by direct force. It could be indirect, so it could be political or economic takeover. Maybe you establish relations with a country and decide that you're going to build a military base on their land. And so we can think of examples of this throughout history. For example, the Spanish invasion of Native American people in the 14 and 1500s in the United States. Okay, so cultural imperialism. So let's continue with this definition. This is typically countries with more political power and wealth are the ones colonizing other groups. And this is still occurring today. So, for example, in 2014, Russia invaded the area of Ukraine called Crimea. And this was a cartoon sort of printed after this occurred. And it depicts Russia as being a big sort of grizzly bear, and then Ukraine being this smaller character. And the cartoon says, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So Russian government said that actually Crimea needed help with their infrastructure, and so they were going to go in and sort of assist or give aid to this region. But really, they went in with tanks and sort of just took over this area. So what happened after this? Some of the results of Russia's invasion of Crimea. So there was new construction of roads, schools, and hospitals, and Russia claimed that their goal was to improve the area and improve the economy. But the people of Crimea have reported a lack of political freedoms now, that they can't find jobs or work, and the prices of goods and services have nearly doubled. So imperialism and colonialism continues today through corporations, and we call this corporate colonialism. So things like offshoring, for example. This is when a wealthy or powerful nation or business establishes settlements or businesses in a different country and exploits their resources. So one such company, Shell, admit to spilling oil in the Niger Delta. And so in this particular area, people were fishermen and farmers, and because of this oil spill, it polluted the area, not allowing them to farm or fish. So it polluted their wells for drinking water, farming, and fishing regions. So eventually Shell had to pay out $84 million to the people in the town of Bodo because of this oil spill. So imperialism can also lead to things like cultural hegemony. Some people might pronounce it hegemony. So this is the influence, especially by one country or social group over another. So for example, maybe a group colonizes another area and then forces things on the group like their education or language or even religion. So this is a side effect of colonialism or imperialism, and it can result in the loss of tradition, cultural norms, values, practices. I already mentioned language, for example. So cultural hegemony can be seen as this like spread of culture, sometimes not welcomed. And we can see this through corporations and through the trading of goods and services. So things like products. The United States makes up 25% of the global toy market, and so we see our toys being exported around the world. For example, Barbie is one of the most popular toys. We also see sales of products and services like Coca-Cola being sold in over 100 countries around the world. Now, while these products are being exported, it's not always welcome. So there are countries that resist Westernization and resist these beliefs, values, norms. So, for example, Afghanistan has come up with their own style of Coca-Cola called Zam Zam Cola, and they also have Mecca Cola. So here's a picture of Mecca Cola. And the Iranian government sponsored their own form of Barbie dolls called Sarah and Dara dolls. So in this depiction, the doll is dressed in a more culturally appropriate way and is also accompanied by her brother, which is sort of in line with cultural practice in Iran. More examples of areas resisting Westernization. So there was an Indian village that was protesting Coca-Cola after the company exploited and polluted their water wells. So what Coca-Cola did was they opened up a bottling plant in a village in India, and they had these high-powered pumps to extract groundwater. But what happened was they ended up extracting so much water that it took water from local wells, leaving those wells dried up. In addition, the factories also dumped chemical waste onto the land, polluting the village's crops. So it was actually local Indian women took to protesting the Coca-Cola company, and as a result, the Indian state court over a few years decided that Coca-Cola had to close this plant, and they ended up closing the plant in 2005. So these are just some examples of imperialism and the resistance to this. All right, so we do see the increase of imports worldwide, and because of this, the United States is becoming a dominant cultural influence. So the U.S. exports things like films, music, games, especially video games, sporting goods, audiovisual products, and I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples of U.S. products that are exported. So what is the single largest export industry for the United States? You kind of might guess it from the title, but the answer is films. So media is one of the things that the United States exports the most. And along with this, we see the export of cultural icons. So if you look at the picture of Tom Hanks down here, you might see some recognizable icons in the background. So you can kind of see the Starbucks coffee there. And now if you travel, we can find Starbucks coffees all over the world. You might also see products in music videos. So this is a Lady Gaga music video here, and see if you can spot any of the products from the United States in this image. Okay. So of the films shown globally, what percentage are produced in Hollywood? So that means, made in Hollywood or made in Los Angeles. The answer is a whopping 85%. So most of the films you see are created and produced right here in Hollywood. And like we talked about with cultural icons, in these films you might see products that are sort of hidden within the film. For example, we might see cars, sunglasses, or even in the movie Zombieland, the promotion of Hostess cupcakes. So let's continue the media and cultural imperialism. I thought this was interesting. There was an article that was titled, "How Korea Became the World's Coolest Brand." So in 1994, there was a U.S. film that grossed more than $300 million, thus inspiring the Korean government, yes, the Korean government, to create and market Korean pop music and films. So, can you guess which U.S. film inspired this? It was actually Jurassic Park. So as you see, the Korean government took note, hey, we can make a profit off of things like pop music and films. And so many people are familiar with K-pop music or Korean pop music. And many of these groups or even individual artists are funded partially by the government. Okay, so with the spread of these cultural icons, we can now sort of recognize different icons from different countries. And I want you to finish this phrase: as American as apple pie. So other US icons that might sort of be associated with the United States would be things like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, sports. For example, baseball is often called America's pastime, and any sort of recognizable symbol that tends to be idolized by a culture or group is known as a cultural icon. So try to think of some cultural icons from the United States or even from different countries around the world. So some international icons that I think of would be baseball, things that you might see in London, like the London Underground or double-decker buses. Definitely royals are cultural icons. We have a picture here of Harry and Meghan Markle, and if you were to go to London, for example, you would see tons of tabloids, probably with their faces on the cover. I want to revisit this cultural icon here, which is a Japanese baseball player. So actually, they now have Major League Baseball in Japan, and it was heavily influenced by American baseball. And so this right here is a picture of a professional Japanese baseball player. Okay, so what is the most recognizable international icon in China? So if you were going to go to China and ask people, do you recognize these icons? Which one would be most recognizable? Many of you probably wouldn't guess, but it is actually KFC. And so you might be thinking, I wonder why KFC is so recognizable. So there were a lot of protests against the Chinese government in the 1980s, late 1980s, and a push for democracy. And these protests were occurring in Tiananmen Square, which is sort of like a Times Square in China, and they were televised. And behind these protests was the KFC restaurant. And many people were like, what is this restaurant? And I would like to go there. So after the 80s, there were some 3,000 KFC restaurants established in China. Okay, so now let's talk about international icons and how to market these icons. So we know that Disney is a major international icon, especially Mickey and Minnie Mouse. And when Disney decided to create new theme parks, they came up with Euro Disney, but they devalued their iconic status. So what they had in the park were small Minnie and Mickey icons, so like little tiny icons printed on shirts. They had smaller Euro-style cafes. And the park didn't do well at all because locals reported that they wanted big icons. They wanted the Mickey ears. They wanted fast food. They wanted finger food like chicken strips and French fries. And so Disney closed and reopened as Disneyland Paris, and has since been successful with that. So the spread of cultural beliefs is called cultural diffusion. So we're going to talk about cultural diffusion. So we have what's called a change agent. So this is a person who influenced the innovation of new ideas. And then we have opinion leaders or individuals who give their opinions informally and then influence others. So the change agent might be, let's say, Disneyland. And then the opinion leaders would be the people who go to the park and then tell their friends, like, oh, you have to go here. It's so fun. So usually opinion leaders are younger and educated. They're usually familiar with technology and more accepting of change, and they might even be defined as risk takers. So for example, the iPhone is popular because of this. And so the iPhone is sold in 130 countries now. And I think of my grandma in this situation. Like as soon as the new phone comes out, I want to run out and buy it. And she's there with her old Nokia flip phone and she's like, no, I do not need a new phone. I don't want it. And so she's not really interested in that. Until, of course, her friend has one and she's showing pictures of her grandchildren on her phone. Then she calls me up and says, hey, Jenna, can you get me one of those smartphones with a camera in it? So it's sort of an example of how cultural diffusion works. All right, so this is the diffusion model, and if you look off to the left, we have these innovators who come up with these ideas and then share them. So we have next early adopters. So these are people that grab the phone and think, oh, this is great, I love this phone. This model uses the idea of a camera, and if you remember, Ashton Kutcher was like a spokesperson for this camera model. And so you might see now this early majority of like more people using the product or celebrities endorsing the product. And so it then gains more popularity. Then we have this late majority. So this might be people that, hear about the product and are like, oh, I have heard something about this. I think I saw this when I went to Sam's Club or when I went to Costco, for example. And so then this late majority, which might be like my parents, for example, start to adapt the product and use the product. And then finally, at the end, we have these laggers who feel overwhelmed sometimes because it seems like there might be a new product coming out before they're even familiar with the old product. So you see this little cartoon here saying, oh, sigh, another new product. All right, so the marketing of these products requires convergence. So Convergence Model is based on a critique of the Diffusion Model. So the Diffusion Model says, hey, there's this new product and it's just spread and everybody loves it. But the Convergence Model says that communication is this process. And so we should speak to local groups and see if they like the products and should we change them to meet the need. So the convergence model says that individuals converge or communicate over time toward a greater degree of mutual agreement. So I'll give you an example. McDonald's in India has now featured the Maharaja Mac. And if you are in India, you know that cows are sacred, and so beef is not typically eaten in India. And so this is a all mutton patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. So they talked to people in the area and they thought, well, what kind of product would sell in India? And they changed the Big Mac a little bit to fit the need. Other examples would be there's a McCurry pan, which has like a curry style. It's all vegetarian. Many people in India are also vegetarian. And so it's kind of like a vegetarian curry. All right, and so how do we adapt these cultural icons and messages so that they work with other groups? The key to this model is adapting the message to the culture that it is intended for. So for example, there is a Disney China, and so they had to figure out ways to sort of market Disney to people in China. So what they did was they localized the thinking and the product and also marketed locally as well. So Disney China kept the big icons like Mickey and Minnie and characters the same, but they consulted feng shui experts to place elements in harmony around the park. They also have gardens that you can walk through. And you can find, there's like a little chameleon character from Tangled, and you can find this hidden chameleon all over the gardens in this park in China. And they also created commercials and short TV programs that featured segments of the park, and they showed them on local television stations in between shows so that people would become familiar with the park and then get excited to go there. If you look as well, they also have a cherry blossom festival, and we see Mickey and Minnie here dressed in traditional Chinese attire for Disney's Cherry Blossom Festival. And so these large cultural icons, like a Mickey and Minnie, for example, need less modification. So if it's a well-known product, then it's going to be more known by the local people. Okay, so today we talked about the contact zone. We talked about globalization and the different effects of globalization. We talked about imperialism, corporate colonialism. There we go, cultural icons and recognizable icons around the world. We talked about cultural diffusion and the spread of products and ideas. And then finally, we talked about how to market these items around the world. Okay, if you have any questions about this chapter, feel free to email me.